Well, hello. We're starting out today on page 284. On the point of knocking at the shutters, he felt a pang of shame, thinking that Odette was going to know he had been suspicious. That he had come back, that he had posted himself in the street. She had often told him what a horror she had of jealous men, of lovers who spied. What he was about to do was very uncouth, and from now on she would detest him, whereas now, for the moment, as long as he had not knocked, perhaps while even deceiving him, she loved him. How often we sacrifice the fulfillment of a possible happiness to our impatience for an immediate pleasure. He knew the reality of certain circumstances which he would have given his life to reconstruct accurately could be read behind that window striated with light, as under the gold-illuminated cover of one of those precious manuscripts to whose artistic richness itself the scholar who consults them cannot remain indifferent. He felt a delicious pleasure in learning the truth that so impassioned him from this unique, ephemeral, and precious transcript made of a translucent substance so warm and so beautiful. Then, too, the advantage he felt he had, that he so needed to feel he had, over them, lay perhaps less in knowing than in being able to show them he knew. He raised himself up on his tiptoes. He knocked. They had not heard. He knocked again, more loudly. The conversation stopped. A man's voice, which he tried to distinguish from among the voices of those of Odette's friends whom he knew, asked, "Who's there?" He was not sure he recognized it. He knocked again. The window was opened, then the shutters. Now there was no way to retreat. And since she was going to know everything, so as not to seem too wretched, too jealous and curious, he merely called out carelessly and gaily, "Please don't go to any trouble. I was just passing by and I saw the light. I wanted to know if you were feeling better." He looked. Before him, two old gentlemen were standing at the window, one holding a lamp, and then he saw the bedroom, a bedroom unknown to him. Because he was in the habit, when he came to Odette's house very late, of recognizing her window by the fact it was the only one lit among windows that were all alike, he had made a mistake and knocked at the window after hers, which belonged to the adjoining house. He went away, apologizing, and returned home, happy that the satisfaction of his curiosity had left their love intact, and that after having simulated a sort of indifference towards Odette for so long, he had not given her by his jealousy that proof of loving her too much, which, between two lovers, exempts forever after from loving enough the one who receives it. He did not talk to her about this misadventure. He himself did not think about it further, but now and then his thoughts, as they moved about, would come upon the memory of it, which they had not noticed, bump up against it, drive it further in, and Swann would feel a sudden deep pain. As if it were a physical pain, Swann's mind could not lessen it, but at least with physical pain, because it is independent of thought. Thought can dwell on it, note that it has diminished, that it has momentarily ceased, but with this pain of the mind, merely by recalling it, recreated it. To wish not to think about it was still to think about it, still to suffer from it. And when, chatting with friends, he forgot his hurt, all of a sudden a word someone said to him would make him his expression change. Like a man with an injury whom some clumsy person has just carelessly touched his sore arm or leg. When he left Odette, he was happy, he felt calm, he recalled her smiles, derisive when speaking of this or that other person, and affectionate towards him. The heaviness of her head, which she had shifted from its axis to incline it, let it fall, almost despite herself, onto his lips, as she had done the first time in the carriage. The languishing look she cast at him while she was in his arms, as with a shiver she pulled her inclined head in against his shoulder. But instantly his jealousy, as if it were the shadow of his love, would furnish itself with a duplicate of the new smile she had given him that very evening, and which, in verse now, mocked Swann, and was filled with love for another man. With that inclination of her head, but reversed towards other lips, with all the marks of affection now given to another man that she had given him, and all the sensuous memories he carried away from her house were like so many sketches, plans like those a decorator submits to you, that allowed Swann to form the idea of the ardent or swooning attitude she might adopt with other men, so that he came to regret every pleasure he enjoyed with her, every invented caress whose sweetness he had been so imprudent as to point out to her, every grace he had discovered in her, for he knew that a moment later they would supply new instruments for torturing him. This torture became still crueler when Swann remembered a brief expression he had surprised a few days before for the first time in Odette's eyes. It was after dinner at the Verdurins, either because Fourchette, feeling that Seignette, his brother-in-law, was not in favor in their house, wanted to use him as a whipping boy and shine in front of them at his expense, or because he had been irritated by a clumsy remark which Seignette had just made to him, and which, in fact, had gone unnoticed by those present, who were not aware of the unpleasant allusion it might contain, quite contrary to the intentions of the one who had uttered it without any malice, or finally because some time now he had been looking for an opportunity to induce them to banish from the house someone who was too well acquainted with him, and whom he knew to be so refined that he felt embarrassed at certain moments merely by his presence. Forcheville answered this clumsy remark of Seignette's with such coarseness, hurling insults at him, and emboldened, as he shouted, by Seignette's pain, his dismay, his entreaties, that the wretched man, after asking Madame Verdurin if he ought to stay, and receiving no answer, had left the house stammering, tears in his eyes. Odette had watched the scene impassively, but when the door closed on Seignette, lowering, as it were, by several notches, her face's habitual expression, so as to be able to find herself in her baseness on an equal footing with Forcheville, she had put a sparkle in her eye with a sly smile of congratulations for the audacity he had shown, of mockery for the man who had been its victim. She cast him a glance of complicity in evil which was so clearly intended to say, "That finished him off," or "I'm very mistaken. Did you see how pathetic he looked? He was actually crying." That Forcheville, when his eyes met that glance, sobering in a moment from the anger of simulation, or the anger of simulation, sobering in a moment from the anger or simulation of anger, which still warmed him, smiled and answered, he needed only to be friendly, and he would still be here. A good rebuke does a man no harm at any age. One day, when Swann had gone out in the middle of the afternoon to pay a call, not having found the person he wanted to see, it occurred to him to go to Odette's house at an hour when he never went there, but when he knew she was always at home having her nap or writing letters before tea-time, and when he would enjoy seeing her for a little while without bothering her. The concierge told him he thought she was there. He rang, though he heard a noise, heard footsteps, but no one answered the door. Anxious, irritated, he went into the little street on which the other side of the house looked, stood in front of the window of Odette's room. The curtains prevented him from seeing anything. He knocked hard on the window panes, called out. No one opened the window. He saw that some neighbors were watching him. He went away, thinking that, after all, perhaps he had been mistaken in believing he heard footsteps, but he remained so preoccupied by it that he could not think about anything else. An hour later he came back. He found her there. She told him she had been at home earlier when he rang, but was sleeping. The bell had woken her. She had guessed it was Swann. She had run after him, but he had already left. She had certainly heard the sound of knocking at the window panes. Swann immediately recognized this statement as one of those fragments of true fact with which liars, when caught unprepared, console themselves by introducing into the composition of the falsehood they are inventing, believing they can accommodate it there and steal its resemblance to the truth. Of course, when Odette had just done something she did not want to reveal, she would hide it deep inside herself. But as soon as she found herself face to face with a man to whom she wanted to lie, she was overcome with uneasiness. Her ideas collapsed. Her faculties of invention and reasoning were paralyzed. She found nothing in her head but emptiness, yet it was necessary to say something, and all she would find within reach was the very thing she had wanted to conceal, and which, being true, was all that had remained there. She would detach a little piece from it, unimportant in itself, telling herself that after all, this was better, since the detail was authentic and did not present the same dangers as a false detail. At least this is true, she would say to herself. So much is gained anyway. He may make inquiries, and he'll see that it's true. So at least it won't be this that gives me away. She was wrong. It was this that gave her away. She did not realize that the true detail had angles that could fit into only the contiguous details of the true fact from which she had arbitrarily detached it, angles which, whatever the invented details among which she might place it, would always reveal by the excess material and unfilled empty areas that it was not from among these that it had come. She admits that she heard me ring, then knock, and that she thought it was me, that she wanted to see me, Swann said to himself. But this does not conform with the fact that no one opened the door. How very Arthur Conan Doyle. But he did not point out this contradiction to her, because he thought that, left to herself, Odette would perhaps produce some lie that would be a faint indication of the truth. She would talk. He would not interrupt her. He would collect with avid and painful piety the words she said to him, feeling, precisely because she was hiding it behind them as she talked to him, that, like the sacred veil, they retained the vague imprint sketched the uncertain features of that reality so infinitely precise and, alas, undiscoverable. What she had been doing that afternoon at 3 o'clock when he came, of which he would never possess more than these lies, illegible and divine vestiges, and which now existed only in the memory of this woman, who would conceal it like stolen goods and contemplate it without being able to appreciate it, but would not hand it over to him. Of course, he fully suspected at times that in themselves Odette's daily actions were not passionately interesting, and that the relationships she might have with other men did not naturally, universally, and for every intelligent creature exhale a morbid sadness capable of affecting one with a feverish desire to commit suicide. He would then realize that this interest, this sadness, existed only in him like a disease, and that once this disease was cured, Odette's actions, the kisses she might have given, would become once again as harmless as those of so many other women. But the fact that the painful curiosity which Swann brought to them now had its origin only in himself was not enough to make him think it was unreasonable to consider this curiosity important, and to use every possible means to satisfy it. For Swann was reaching an age, the philosophy of which, encouraged in this case by the current philosophy of the day, and also by that of the circle in which he had spent so much time of his life, that of the social set attached to the Princesse de Long, where one's intelligence was understood to be in direct ratio to one's skepticism, and nothing was real and contestable except the individual tastes of each person, is no longer that of youth, but the positive, almost medical philosophy of men who, instead of externalizing the objects of their aspirations, try to derive from the years they have already lived a stable residue of habits and passions, which they can regard as characteristic and permanent, and to which, deliberately, they will take care before anything else that the kind of life they adopt may provide satisfaction. Swann thought it prudent to make allowance in his life for the pain he felt at not knowing what Odette had been doing, just as he made allowance for the fresh outbreak which a damp climate might cause in his eczema. To provide in his budget for a sizable sum of available funds for obtaining information about how Odette spent her days, without which he would feel unhappy, just as he reserved the same for other particularities from which he knew he could expect to derive pleasure, at least before he had fallen in love, like his partiality for collections and for good food. When he tried to say goodbye to Odette in order to leave for home, she asked him to stay longer, and even held him back suddenly by taking his arm, when he was about to open the door to go out. But he took no notice of this, because among the multitude of gestures, remarks, minor incidents that fill a conversation, it is inevitable that we should come close without detecting anything in them to attract our attention. To those that hide a truth our suspicions are blindly seeking, that we should stop, on the other hand, at those behind which there is nothing. She kept saying to him, "How unfortunate, you never come in the afternoon, and the one time you do, I don't see you." He knew very well that she was not sufficiently in love with him to be so keenly distressed at having missed his visit, but because she was good, desirous of pleasing him, and often sad when she had vexed him, he found it quite natural that she should be sad this time at having deprived him the pleasure of spending an hour together, a very great pleasure, not for her, but for him. Yet it was a thing unimportant enough, so that the pained air she continued to have ended by surprising him. She reminded him even more than usual, when she looked this way, of the faces of the women portrayed by the painter of the Primavera. She had at this moment their downcast and broken expression, which seemed to be succumbing beneath the weight of a grief too heavy for them, when they are merely letting the child Jesus play with a pomegranate or watching Moses pour water into a trough. He had once before seen the same sadness on her face, but he no longer knew when. And suddenly he remembered. It was when Odette had lied in talking to Madame Verdurin the day after that dinner, to which she had not come on the pretext that she was ill, and in reality so that she could stay with Swann. Reading's hard, y'all. Of course, even if she had been the most scrupulous of women, she might not have felt remorse over a lie as innocent. But the lies Odette generally told were less innocent and served to prevent the discoveries that might have created for her, with one person or another, terrible difficulties. And so, when she lied, struck by fear, aware that she was feebly armed to defend herself, uncertain of success, she wanted to cry from exhaustion, like certain children who have not slept. And she also knew that her lie was usually doing serious harm, to the man to whom she was telling it, and into whose power she was certainly going to fall if she lied badly. And so she felt at once humble and guilty in his presence, and when she had to tell an insignificant social lie, the association of sensations and memories would leave her with the faintness that follows overexertion and the regret that follows an act of malevolence. What depressing lie was she telling Swann that gave her this pained look, this plaintive voice which seemed to falter under effort that she demanded of herself and to ask for forgiveness? He had an idea that it was not merely the truth about the incident in the afternoon that she was endeavoring to hide from him, but something more immediate, that had perhaps not yet transpired, and was quite imminent, something that might enlighten him about this truth. At that moment, he heard the bell ring. Odette did not stop talking, but her words were now no more than a long lament. Her regret at not having seen Swann in the afternoon, at not having opened the door, had turned into true despair. He could hear the front door closing again and the sound of a carriage as if someone was going away, probably the one Swann was not supposed to meet, after being told that Odette was out. Then, when he reflected that merely by coming at an hour when he was not in the habit of coming, he had managed to disturb so many arrangements she did not want him to discover, he was overcome with a feeling of discouragement, almost despondency. But because he loved Odette, because he was in the habit of turning all his thoughts towards her, the pity he might have inspired in himself, he felt for her instead, and he murmured, "Poor darling," as he was leaving her. She picked up several letters that she had on her table and asked him if he would put them in the post. He took them away with him, and once he was home, saw that he had kept the letters on him. He returned as far as the post office, drew them from his pocket, and before tossing them into the box, looked at the addresses. They were all for tradesmen, except for one which was for Forcheville. He held it in his hands. He said to himself, "If I saw what was inside, I would know what she calls him, how she talks to him, if there's anything between them. It may even be that by not looking, I'm behaving with a lack of delicacy towards Odette, because this is the only way to free myself of a suspicion which is perhaps calumnious for her, which is in any case bound to hurt her, and which nothing would be able to destroy once this letter was gone." He returned home after leaving the post office, but he had kept that last letter with him. He lit a candle and held up close to it the envelope that he had not dared to open. At first he could not read anything, but the envelope was thin, and by making it adhere to the stiff card that was enclosed in it, he could read through its transparency the last words. It was a cold, formal ending. If he had not been the one looking at a letter addressed to Forcheville, but instead Forcheville reading a letter addressed to Swann, Forcheville would have seen words that were more affectionate. He took firm hold of the card that danced in the envelope, which was larger than it was. Then, sliding it with his thumb, brought its different lines, one after another, under the part of the envelope where the paper was not doubled. The other part, the only part through which one could read. Despite this, he could not distinguish anything very well, but it did not matter, because he had seen enough to realize its subject was a minor, unimportant event that had nothing to do with a love affair. It was some unimportant thing related to an uncle of Odette's. Swann had read clearly at the beginning of a line, "I was right," but did not understand what Odette had been right in doing, when suddenly a word he had not at first been able to decipher appeared and illuminated the entire meaning of this sentence. I was right to open the door. It was my uncle. Open the door. So Forcheville had been there that afternoon when Swann rang the bell. And she had made him leave, which was the sound Swann had heard. Then he read the whole letter. At the end, she apologized for having acted so unceremoniously towards him, and said he had forgotten his cigarettes at her house. The same sentence she had written to Swann one of the first times he had come. But in Swann's case, she had added, if you had left your heart here, I would not have let you take it away again. For Forcheville, nothing like that, no allusion that might suggest they were having an affair. And in fact, Forcheville was more deceived in all this than he was, since Odette was writing to him to assure him that the visitor had been her uncle. In the end, he, Swann, was the one she considered important, the one for whom she had dismissed the other. And yet, if there was nothing between Odette and Forcheville, why had she not opened the door right away? Why had she said, I did the right thing to open the door, it was my uncle, if she was doing nothing wrong at that moment? How would Forcheville even be able to explain to himself the fact that she had not opened the door? Swann remained there, disconsolate, embarrassed, and yet happy, with his envelope, which Odette had handed to him quite fearlessly. So absolute was her confidence in his discretion, but through the transparent glazing of which was revealed to him, along with the secret of an incident which he would never have believed it possible to discover, a little of Odette's life, as in a narrow, illuminated section cut directly out of the unknown. Then his jealousy rejoiced over it, as if that jealousy had an independent, selfish vitality, voracious for anything that would feed it, even at Swann's expense. Now it had something to feed on, and Swann was going to be able to begin worrying each day over the visitors Odette received. At about 5 o'clock, and began trying to learn where Forcheville had been at that hour. For Swann's affection continued to preserve the same character imprinted on it from the very beginning by his ignorance as to how Odette spent her days, and by the mental laziness that stopped him from compensating for his ignorance with his imagination. He had not been jealous at first of Odette's whole life, but only of the times when some circumstances, perhaps wrongly interpreted, led him to suppose that Odette might have deceived him. His jealousy, like an octopus that casts a first, then a second, then a third mooring, attaching itself solidly first to that time, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, then to another, then yet to another. But Swann was not capable of inventing this suffering. They were merely the memory, the perpetuation of a suffering that had come to him from outside himself. From outside, however, everything brought him more suffering. He wanted to separate Odette from Forcheville, take her away to spend a few days in the south, but he believed all the men who happened to be in the hotel desired her, and that she desired them. And so he who in former days, when traveling, had sought out new people, large groups, now appeared unsociable, appearing to be fleeting the company of men, as if it had cruelly wounded him. And how could he not be misanthropic when he saw every man as a possible lover of Odette's? And so his jealousy, even more than the sensuous and light-hearted feeling he had at first had for Odette, altered Swann's character and changed entirely in the eyes of other people the very appearance of the external signs by which that character was manifested. That is page 294, where we're stopping for today.